On the night of December 24th, 1879, Maryanne Whitaker found herself exactly where she'd spent the previous 2 Christmases, completely alone, seated at a table set for one. She stared at the empty plate while snow fell silently outside the window of her small cabin in Wyoming. 30 years old. 3 Christmases on the frontier, 0 reasons to expect the 4th would be any different. Then she heard the desperate knocks, urgent, as if someone were using their last bit of strength. Maryanne froze. No one knocked on her door. No one came to visit. The community had made it clear long ago that a single woman who'd fled her engagement didn't deserve their company. The knocks repeated, louder this time. When she opened the door, the icy air stole her breath. But it wasn't the cold that left her speechless. It was the snow-covered man holding 2 shivering girls in his arms. "Please." The man's voice was barely a broken whisper. "The storm destroyed our home. My daughters are freezing." The little one's eyes, one maybe 10 years old, the other, barely 8, looked at her with a mix of terror and hope that Maryanne recognized all too well. It was the same look she'd seen in her own reflection 3 years ago, when she arrived on this unforgiving frontier, seeking a place to hide from her past. In that instant, Maryanne Whitaker didn't know she was about to open much more than a door. She was about to open the possibility of being saved by the very people who needed her salvation. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "Quick." And with those 2 simple words, her fate changed forever. Hold on, my dear friends. I want to get to know you better. Tell me in the comments from what city and country you're joining us. And if you want to join us for every story on every story, subscribe right now. Let's continue with the tale. As Maryanne wrapped the girls in blankets by the fire and prepared hot tea with trembling hands, the man caught his breath enough to explain. His name was Mark Harrison, a farmer, widowed. His small property was 5 miles to the east. But the sudden storm had torn down half the structure that afternoon. He had no choice but to seek shelter. He saw the light from Maryanne's cabin along the path. The girls, Abigail at 10 and Sophie at 8, were scared but trying to be brave. They huddled together, watching everything with wide eyes. Mark noticed the table set for one. A single candle, a single plate. Were you going to eat alone on Christmas Eve? The question held no malice, just genuine surprise. Maryanne didn't look up as she served the tea. "I always eat alone." The silence that followed was more eloquent than any reply. Mark looked around the cabin, small, tidy, utterly devoid of any Christmas decorations. Not a pine branch, not a red candle, nothing to suggest. Tomorrow was the most important day of the year. It was a house prepared for solitude, and it had just received an entire family. Maryanne had arrived in Wyoming in the spring of 1877, fleeing a life that would have destroyed her soul long before her body. Her family, in Kansas, had arranged her marriage to Richard Donovan, son of a powerful landowner, a respectable man who drank too much and whose idea of marital love included closed fists and words that cut deeper than any knife. 3 weeks before the wedding, after he beat her for looking at him with insolence, Maryanne had stolen her father's horse and ridden west into the frontier night. The frontier promised freedom. What she found was another kind of prison. As an independent seamstress, she tried to make an honest living. But a single woman who'd abandoned her fiancé was viewed with suspicion. Rumors preceded her at every door. Respectable wives stopped commissioning dresses. Merchants charged her double. Invitations to dances and celebrations never came. Little by little, Maryanne became invisible. The first Christmas alone was painful. By the second, she'd convinced herself it was her deserved penance. For the third, this one, she'd accepted that solitude was simply her fate. Until 3 snow-covered strangers appeared at her door. Now, watching Mark clumsily try to comb Sophie's tangled hair with his large, calloused hands. Seeing the girl's worn clothes, the deep exhaustion etched in every line of the man's face, Maryanne wondered how much longer he could go on alone. And she wondered something even more dangerous. How much longer could she? Abigail watched her with curiosity. "Do you have children, miss?" The silence fell like a stone in still water. "Abigail, don't ask inappropriate questions." Mark gently reprimanded his daughter. Maryanne forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "No, I never wanted any." The lie burned her throat as it came out. Because the truth, the shameful secret she guarded, was that she did want them. She'd wanted a family so much. It hurt. But she'd learned that some women didn't deserve that blessing. Mark studied her with eyes that saw too much, but said nothing. The storm worsened through the night. The wind howled like a wounded animal, battering the cabin walls with unrelenting fury. Mark realized with growing horror that they couldn't leave soon, maybe not for days. "We'll sleep in the barn," he declared, standing with forced determination. "With the girls, we can't impose on you. They'd freeze to death before dawn." Maryanne interrupted firmly. "The girls sleep in my bed, you on the sofa. No arguments." Mark opened his mouth to protest, saw the look on Maryanne's face, and closed it again. But as she arranged blankets on the narrow sofa, panic began climbing Maryanne's throat like poisonous ivy. They'd be here for days. This family, with their nervous laughter, instinctive hugs, palpable human warmth, would be in her sacred space of solitude for days, and right through Christmas. The wound Maryanne had spent 3 years burying. The one that bled every time she saw a mother with her children at the market, every time she heard family laughter from other homes, would be exposed and raw. How would she survive this? Abigail and Sophie curled up in bed beside her that first night, their little bodies still shivering from the cold. Sophie instinctively sought Maryanne's hand in the darkness. The small gesture nearly shattered every defense Maryanne had built. On the sofa, Mark wasn't sleeping either. He stared at the beamed ceiling as a thought tormented him. Helen, his wife, dead 2 years ago, trying to give him a son who was stillborn along with her. Accepting help from this strange woman, seeing his daughters curl up with someone who wasn't their mother, feeling relieved. Wasn't that betrayal? Helen had been his everything. How could he even contemplate the possibility? He couldn't, could he? But then he heard the soft sound of Maryanne singing a lullaby in a gentle melody to his daughters, and something in his chest, frozen for 2 years, began very slowly to thaw, and that terrified him more than any storm. The first dawn came with a deceptive silence. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cabin, something had shifted overnight. Mark woke to the aroma of fresh coffee and biscuits warming on the griddle. He sat up on the sofa, disoriented, and found Maryanne already dressed, moving through the kitchen with quiet efficiency. The scene hit him like a punch to the gut. A woman preparing breakfast in the kitchen, the comforting sounds of domestic life, the warmth of a breathing home. He hadn't seen this since Helen died. "Good morning," Maryanne said without turning, as if having strangers sleep in her house was perfectly normal. "The coffee's ready." Before Mark could respond, Abigail and Sophie came running from the room, and to his complete surprise, they didn't run to him. They ran straight to Maryanne. Sophie clung to the woman's leg like a lifeline. Abigail, more reserved, stayed close but with eyes shining from something Mark recognized as budding trust. "Can we help with breakfast?" Abigail asked shyly. Maryanne went still for a moment, clearly disarmed. Then slowly, she nodded. "Sure, Sophie. You can set the plates. Abigail, you bring the napkins." The girls sprang into action with enthusiasm bordering on desperation. Mark watched from the sofa, paralyzed by a terrifying revelation. His daughters were starving for a mother figure, and he'd been too blind, or too cowardly, to see it. He'd just crossed the threshold into unknown and dangerous territory, depending on someone else, trusting, perhaps eventually feeling more than survival. And Maryanne, serving biscuits to girls who weren't hers, with slightly trembling hands, had crossed her own threshold for the first time in 3 years. Her house wasn't just a refuge of solitude anymore. It was a home with people in it, and that terrified her as much as it consoled her. Confined by the storm, the four were forced to share a space designed for one. On the second day, Abigail, always observant, always thoughtful, noticed something that disturbed her deeply. "Miss Maryanne," she asked, while helping dry the lunch dishes, "why don't you have any Christmas decorations?" Maryanne kept washing without looking up. "No point in decorating just for me." Sophie, sitting on the floor playing with rag dolls Maryanne had found in a trunk, looked up. "That's really sad." The plate nearly slipped from Maryanne's hand. Mark stepped in quickly, wanting to protect her from his daughter's innocent but cruel judgment. "Girls, everyone celebrates the holidays their own way. But she doesn't celebrate at all," Abigail interrupted, looking straight at Maryanne with eyes too wise for her age. "Do you?" The silence stretched thick and uncomfortable. Maryanne finally dried her hands and turned to face the girl. "No, I don't." "Why not?" Sophie asked. "Because no one invites me. Because I'm invisible. Because I've convinced myself I don't deserve joy. Because that's just how things are." That's what she said aloud. That night, after the girls were asleep, Mark and Maryanne sat together for the first time, truly alone. He insisted on helping her wash the dinner dishes. They worked in companionable silence for several minutes. Then Mark spoke, his voice low and rough. "My wife was named Helen." Maryanne stopped washing, waiting. She was strong, funny, made the girls laugh even on the hardest days. He paused, struggling with the words. "She died 2 years ago, trying to give me a son who didn't survive either." The guilt in his voice was so thick, Maryanne could almost touch it. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It was my fault. I wanted more children." She was tired, her body weak after Abigail and Sophie. But I insisted. His voice broke. Maryanne did something instinctive. She touched his hand. "It wasn't your fault." Mark looked at her with damp eyes. "How can you know?" And then, against all her self-protective instincts, Maryanne shared her own story. The engagement, the violence, the flight, the self-imposed exile. For the first time in 3 years, she was heard. For the first time in 2 years, Mark felt someone understood his pain. Amid the dirty dishes and the dying fire, 2 broken souls recognized each other's fractures. The days trapped together transformed into something unexpectedly beautiful. The storm continued relentlessly, but inside the cabin, an almost magical routine began to form. Maryanne taught the girls to sew small ornaments from fabric scraps. Abigail, with careful fingers, created angels. Sophie, more impatient, made crooked stars that made her giggle. Mark fixed things Maryanne had ignored for months. A loose hinge, a creaking floorboard, the cupboard door that wouldn't close right. "You don't have to do this," Maryanne protested. "I want to," he replied simply. And it was true. For the first time since Helen's death, Mark felt useful in a way that wasn't just raw survival. He was caring, building, becoming part of something bigger than his own grief. One afternoon, while Abigail helped Maryanne prepare stew for dinner, the girl spoke softly. "This will be our 3rd Christmas without Mom." Maryanne's hands stilled over the pot. Abigail continued, her words careful but honest. "Dad tries to make it special every year. The first year, he tried cooking her favorite meal, but it all burned and he cried. The second year, he took us to church, but had to leave midway through the service because he was too sad. This year, he didn't even mention Christmas until the storm wrecked the house." Maryanne felt her heart break for the man in the other room. Sophie, who'd been listening, added with the frankness of an 8-year-old, "We prayed for a new mom. Do you think God heard us?" Maryanne had to leave the kitchen before the girls saw her tears. Mark found her on the small covered porch, hugging herself against the cold, watching the snow fall. Without a word, he removed his coat and placed it over her shoulders. They stood side by side in companionable silence. "My daughters love you," Mark said finally. "They barely know me. Children know things adults forget." He paused. "They know who's safe, who's good, who." He stopped. But Maryanne heard the unspoken words. "Who could love them?" "This is temporary," Maryanne whispered, more to remind herself than him. "When the storm passes, you'll go back to your life." "What if I don't want to just go back to my life?" Mark's voice was barely audible over the wind. "What if I want something more?" Maryanne turned to look at him. In the dim winter twilight, she saw absolute vulnerability in his eyes. "I'm not who you think I am," she said. "I'm a woman who ran away, who's alone for a reason, who gets up before dawn to make coffee for strangers," Mark interrupted gently. "Who patiently teaches my daughters, even though it clearly hurts her, who sings lullabies with a soothing voice, who makes them feel safe for the first time in 2 years. That's who I see you as." Before Maryanne could reply, Abigail called from inside, "The stew's ready." The moment broke, but something had shifted between them. That night, after dinner, something magical happened. As Maryanne cleaned up, she began humming an old carol her grandmother used to sing back in Kansas. A Christmas melody she hadn't sung in years. Abigail recognized it. They'd sung it at school. "I know that song." and she started singing in a clear, sweet voice. Sophie joined in, off-key but enthusiastic. Mark, surprised, pulled something from his pack that Maryanne hadn't seen before. A small harmonica. It was my father's, he explained, almost shy. I haven't played it since. Play it. Maryanne encouraged him, and he did. The music filled the small cabin. Abigail and Sophie danced, pulling Maryanne's hands until she, laughing through tears, she couldn't hold back, joined their clumsy, joyful dance. Mark played, watching them, and for the first time since Helen's death, he felt something he'd forgotten existed. Pure joy. When the girls finally collapsed, exhausted and happy, Mark helped Maryanne tuck them in. They stood in the doorway, watching Abigail and Sophie sleep deeply, curled up like puppies. "Thank you," Mark whispered, taking Maryanne's hand. "For what?" "For giving us back something I thought we'd lost forever." Maryanne squeezed his hand, unable to speak. And when they finally looked at each other, when their faces were inches apart, when the world shrank to just the two of them, they kissed. It was soft, tentative, sweet. A kiss that tasted of possibility, fear, and hope mingled. When they parted, Mark rested his forehead against hers. "Stay with us," he whispered. "When this ends, I don't want to lose you." Maryanne closed her eyes, savoring the impossible fantasy. For one night, for one perfect and fragile moment, she allowed herself to believe she deserved this, that she deserved to be happy, that she deserved a family. But deep in her heart, fear was already planting seeds of doubt, because good things never lasted. Not for her. Or did they? Christmas morning, Maryanne woke to a strange sound. Laughter. Whispered conspiracies, furtive movement. She rose from the bed where she'd slept alone. The girls had insisted on sleeping on the sofa with their father that night. Squeezed like sardines, and she found a scene that took her breath away. Mark, Abigail, and Sophie had decorated the entire cabin. Pine branches cut from nearby. Trees hung over the door and windows. Small wooden figures, a rough angel, a star, a simple manger, were arranged on the mantel. Strips of colorful fabric, made from Maryanne's sewing scraps, hung like improvised garlands. And in the center of the table, proud and crooked, the ornaments Abigail and Sophie had sewn. "Surprise!" Sophie shouted, bouncing with excitement. Abigail smiled shyly. "We wanted you to have a real Christmas." Maryanne brought her hands to her mouth. The tears came before she could stop them. For the first time in 3 years, she cried from pure joy. Mark approached, gently wiping a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Don't cry. It's Christmas Eve." "I know," Maryanne managed through sobs and laughter. "That's why I'm crying." That night, they prepared a feast with everything they had. Maryanne's last beans, dried meat Mark had saved in, his pack, fresh biscuits, a precious jar of honey Maryanne had been saving for a special occasion. There'd never been a more special occasion than this. During dinner, Sophie asked to say a prayer. Mark hesitated. He hadn't prayed much since Helen died, but nodded. The girl closed her eyes tightly. "Thank you, God, for sending Aunt Maryanne to save us from the storm, and for sending us to save Aunt Maryanne from being alone. Amen." The truth, spoken by innocent lips, fell over them like a revelation. They'd saved each other. After dinner, Mark played the harmonica. Maryanne danced with the girls until they were too tired to stand. When Abigail and Sophie finally fell asleep, exhausted and happy, Mark took Maryanne's hand and led her out to the porch. The storm had passed. The sky was clear for the first time in days, filled with stars so bright they looked like jewels scattered on black velvet. "Thank you for saving us," Mark whispered. Maryanne turned to him, her eyes shining in the starlight. "You saved me first." They kissed under the Christmas Eve sky, and for one perfect moment, everything seemed possible. Everything seemed meant to be. But false victories never last, and morning would bring the cruelest test of all. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold. Mark woke with renewed determination in his eyes. The storm had passed. The roads would start clearing soon. He needed to return to his farm, assess the damage, start repairs before the next winter front arrived. He found Maryanne making coffee, as always. "I have to head back today," he announced without preamble. "See what can be salvaged from the house. Start rebuilding before it's too late. Maryanne felt as if someone had hollowed out her chest, but kept her face carefully neutral. Of course, you have your life. Mark studied her, confused by the sudden coldness in her voice. Maryanne, the girls must be eager to get home. She continued without looking at him, focusing intensely on pouring the coffee. And you have a lot of work to do. Could you come visit us? The words came out awkward, unsure. The girls would love it. I'd love it. Maryanne finally looked at him, and her smile was so false it hurt. Maybe when things settled down. But they both knew what that really meant, didn't they? As Mark prepared the girls to leave, Maryanne felt the old poisonous beliefs return like crows to a carcass. This was temporary. It was always temporary. You don't deserve this family. You're the woman who ran away, the lone woman, the outsider. You'll ruin everything like you ruined before. Better to end it now before it hurts more. Abigail, with the uncanny intuition of children, sensed the change in Maryanne. She approached while her father packed, looking straight into the woman's eyes. Are you going to be alone again? She asked in a small voice. Maryanne swallowed hard. I live here, sweetheart. This is my home. But you like being alone. It wasn't a question. It was a soft accusation. Yes, Maryanne lied. I do. Abigail didn't look away. No, you don't. I saw you crying on the porch. I know you were sad about being alone. Mark called to Abigail, his voice tense. But the damage was done. When they were ready to go, Sophie clung to Maryanne with childish desperation. Please don't go. Maryanne, confused, stroked the girl's hair. I live here, little one. Sophie looked up, her eyes full of tears. Don't go from us. Stay with us. Maryanne couldn't respond. Her throat was too tight. Mark looked at her over his daughters' heads, his eyes pleading. I'll come visit in 2 days. I promise. We need to talk about what this means, about what we could. Sure, Maryanne interrupted, her voice too bright, too false. I'll be here. She watched them leave, 3 dark figures against the white snow, growing smaller until they vanished. Then she closed the door and collapsed against it. The cabin was silent again, empty again, dead again. All the decorations they'd made with such love mocked her from the walls. Maryanne had reclaimed her solitude, and it had never hurt so much. The days passed like dark molasses. 1, 2, 3. Mark didn't return. Maryanne told herself she wasn't waiting, but she was. Every sound outside made her jump. Every passerby on the path made her heart race, but no one stopped. On the 4th day, desperately needing to escape the cabin that smelled of memories and loss, Maryanne rode to the nearest town for supplies. It was a mistake. In the general store, 2 women whispered near the counter. They didn't see her enter. I heard Mark Harrison and his girls spent Christmas with. That runaway woman, the one living alone in the old path cabin, the one who fled her fiancé. That very one. What a scandal. That man's a decent widower. He needs a proper wife for his daughters, not a... Maryanne didn't stay to hear the rest. She left the store with cheeks burning from shame and rage, buying nothing. She rode back to the cabin with the words chasing her like wolves. Scandal, not proper. When she arrived, she found a letter nailed to her door. With trembling hands, she opened it. The letter was from Mark. The handwriting was careful, polite. Too polite. Dear Miss Whitaker, I hope this letter finds you well. I want to thank you again for your generous hospitality during the storm. My house is being rebuilt with the help of kind neighbors, and the repairs are progressing well. Abigail and Sophie ask about you frequently. They speak fondly of their time in your home. When you feel comfortable, we'd love to have you visit. Our door will always be open to you. With gratitude and respect, Mark Harrison. Maryanne read the letter 3 times, searching for something, anything, that resembled the man who'd kissed her under the stars. She found nothing. Dear Miss Whitaker, generous hospitality, with gratitude and respect. Words from a grateful stranger. Not words of love, not words. From a man who'd whispered, I don't want to lose you, against her lips. Maryanne sank into the chair by the table. The same table. Where they'd dined together, laughed together, been a family together. And finally understood the brutal truth. He'd realized it. He'd realized she'd embarrass him, tarnish his reputation, that his daughters deserved better than a woman marked by scandal. The community had spoken, and he'd listened. because that's how the world worked. Decent men didn't stay with women like her. Maryanne had let hope in. She'd lowered her defenses, believed for a few precious and painful days that she deserved to be loved. And now she'd pay the price. Because the price of hope was always devastation when it was snatched away. She burned the Christmas decorations that night, one by one, tossing them into the fire. Abigail's fabric angels, Sophie's crooked stars, the scrap garlands, the figures carved by Mark's hands. All of it. She scrubbed every trace that they'd ever been there. She tried returning to her old life, her comfortable solitude. But it no longer worked. Because now she knew exactly what she was missing. She knew how it felt to wake to children's laughter. She knew how it felt to cook for people who loved her. She knew how it felt to be kissed by a man who saw her worth. And that knowledge was exquisite torture. Maryanne Whitaker was more alone than ever. Because solitude, after knowing love, is infinitely darker than solitude that never knew there was an alternative. A week after Christmas, Maryanne Whitaker hit rock bottom. She didn't sew, barely ate. She spent hours lying in bed, staring at the beamed ceiling, watching shadows shift with the changing daylight. The cabin was perfectly tidy, perfectly silent, perfectly dead, just as it had been before they arrived. But now the silence was deafening, because Maryanne had tasted the alternative. She'd savored what it was, too. Have a family, to be needed, to be loved. And then she'd let it go. No, worse than that. She'd run from it. The revelation came one night as she lay awake in the darkness, unable to sleep, tormented by memories of children's laughter that still seemed to echo off the walls. She'd run again. In Kansas, she'd run from Richard before he could destroy her completely. Here in Wyoming, she'd run from the community that rejected her, hiding in this cabin like a self-imposed grave. And when Mark offered her a way out, when he offered a family, a future, a reason to live beyond mere survival, she'd run from that too. She'd interpreted his formal letter as rejection because she was afraid to see it as what it really was, respect, patience, waiting for her to decide. Mark hadn't abandoned her. She'd abandoned him. She'd abandoned him and those two precious girls who called her aunt and prayed for a mother. Maryanne sat up in bed, shaking with the force of the understanding. She'd spent 3 years convincing herself she deserved to be alone, that solitude was her just penance for abandoning her family in Kansas. But that was the lie. The truth was, she was terrified of being happy, because happiness could be taken away. She was terrified of loving, because love could end in pain. She was terrified of belonging, because belonging meant becoming vulnerable. So she'd chosen not to risk at all, and in doing so, condemned herself to a life that wasn't life at all. Morning came gray and cold. Maryanne rose like a woman emerging from a grave. She washed her face with icy water, brushed her hair, put on her best dress. And as she did, she found something in the pocket she'd forgotten. A small fabric angel, clumsily sewn with uneven thread, the one Abigail had made. She turned it over, and on the back, embroidered in childish, irregular letters, it read, "For Aunt Maryanne, you are our angel." Maryanne closed her eyes and wept. She wept for the 3 wasted years in self-imposed solitude. She wept for the fear that had ruled her so long. She wept for the woman she'd been, and the woman she could become. And when she finished weeping, she made a decision. No more running, no more hiding, no more half-living out of fear of loss. If she was going to lose, let it be after fighting for something worth it, after loving with all she had, after truly living. Maryanne Whitaker saddled her horse as the sun just began rising over the distant mountains. 5 miles to the Harrison farm. 5 miles to change her fate. 5 miles to stop running and start living. She rode east, toward the rising sun, toward fear and hope mixed in equal parts, toward her future. The farm appeared on the horizon as the sun climbed high. Maryanne could see the house, partially rebuilt, new beams gleaming golden against the old wood. Smoke rose from the chimney, signs of life, of home. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it would burst. What if he really didn't want her? What if she'd misread everything? What if... No more what-ifs. She dismounted in front of the house, her legs shaking. Abigail saw her first from the window. Her shout pierced the cold morning air. "Dad! Dad! It's Aunt Maryanne!" The door flew open. Abigail ran out without even grabbing her coat, Sophie right on her heels. They threw themselves into Maryanne's arms with such force they nearly knocked her over. "You came back," Sophie sobbed against her dress. "You came back." Abigail hugged her tightly, half laughing, half crying. "We missed you so much. I thought you'd never come back." Mark emerged more slowly from the barn, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. He stopped, halfway between the barn and where Maryanne knelt, hugging his daughters. Their eyes met across the distance. He didn't smile, didn't run to her, just waited. Waiting to see why she'd come, waiting to see if she'd finally found the courage. Maryanne stood slowly, gently disentangling the girls. "Girls," she said softly, "I need to talk to your father. Can you wait inside?" "But," Abigail started. "Please." Something in Maryanne's voice made the girls obey without further protest, though they kept glancing back as they went into the house. Maryanne and Mark were left alone in the yard. The moment of truth had arrived. Maryanne walked toward Mark until only a few feet separated them. He didn't move, waited, his dark eyes studying her, guarded, protecting his own heart. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "I've spent the last 3 years punishing myself," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "Punishing myself for running from a man who would have destroyed me, convincing myself I deserved to be alone because I'd abandoned my family, my duty, my proper place in the world." Mark listened in silence, his jaw tight. "When you all showed up at my door on Christmas Eve, I wasn't just planning to spend that night alone. I was planning to spend the rest of my life that way. I decided that was my penance, my fate." Her voice cracked, but she continued. "And then you came. You, Abigail, Sophie. And for the first time in 3 years, my house wasn't a tomb. It was a home. For the first time, I wasn't just a hidden woman. I was Aunt Maryanne. I was someone who mattered to someone." Tears began rolling down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. "When I got your letter, I read it as rejection, because I was trained to expect rejection. Because I thought you'd realized I'd embarrass you, tarnish your and your daughter's reputation, that you deserved better." "Maryanne," Mark started, taking a step toward her. She raised a hand, stopping him. "Please, let me finish." He stopped, waiting. "But it wasn't rejection, was it? You were giving me space, time, waiting for me to decide. Because you knew if you pushed, I'd run." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "And you were right. I ran anyway, not physically, but emotionally. I burned all the decorations, erased every trace of you. I tried going back to my comfortable solitude." She wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "But it doesn't work anymore. Because now I know what I'm missing. I know how it feels to wake up to laughter. I know how it feels to be loved. And that knowledge," her voice broke completely, "that knowledge is killing me." Maryanne took another step toward him, closing the gap. "I'm scared, Mark. I'm terrified. I'm afraid of not being enough. I'm afraid of ruining it. I'm afraid you'll love me today and change your mind tomorrow. I'm afraid of loving your daughters and having them decide one day they don't want me. I'm afraid of everything." She finally looked him straight in the eyes. "But I'm more afraid of spending the rest of my life, wondering, what if? More afraid of dying alone and empty, knowing I had a chance at a family, and let it go out of cowardice." Her voice softened to a whisper. "So here I am, terrified, vulnerable, no shields, asking you, begging you, if you still want me, if there's still room for me in your life, in your daughters' lives, I want to try. I want to be part of this family. I want to love you and Abigail and Sophie with everything I have. I want to stop running and start living." A tear rolled down her cheek. "I love you, Mark Harrison, and I love your daughters. And if you'll have me, I promise I'll never run again. I promise to stay and fight and love, even when it's scary, especially when it's scary." She finished, exposed and shaking, waiting for his verdict. The silence stretched for what seemed an eternity. Then Mark closed the distance in 2 long strides. He took her face in his calloused, rough hands, forcing her to look at him. "I wrote that letter 10 times too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Every version said, 'I love you.' Every version begged you to come live with us, to be my wife, to be my daughter's mother. But I was afraid of scaring you off. I was afraid you'd think it was obligation, gratitude, not real love. His thumbs gently wiped her tears, so I wrote the safest version, the most cowardly one. And I hated every word as I wrote it. He leaned in until their foreheads touched. You don't have to be enough, Maryanne. You already are more than I ever dreamed of finding again. You didn't just save us from the storm, you saved us from an empty house, empty hearts, a life that was just survival without joy. His voice cracked. I have fears too. I'm afraid you'll think I'm betraying Helen's memory. I'm afraid I can't give you everything you deserve. I'm afraid of losing you like I lost her. He kissed her forehead softly. But like you said, I'm more afraid of living the rest of my life without trying. The house door burst open. Abigail and Sophie came running out, unable to wait any longer. Does that mean you're staying? Abigail asked, her eyes bright with hope and fear mixed. Are you going to be our mom? Sophie added, clinging to Maryanne's skirt. Maryanne looked to Mark for permission. He nodded, his own eyes damp. Maryanne knelt to the girl's level. If you want me, if you'll have me, I'd love to try. I'd love to be your family. Yes, Sophie shouted, throwing herself into her arms. Abigail, more reserved but no less excited, joined the hug. We want you, she whispered against Maryanne's shoulder. We always wanted you. Mark wrapped all three in his arms, creating a complete circle. A broken and mended family, with scars and fears, but whole. The promise was fulfilled, Mark murmured against Maryanne's hair. You were going to spend Christmas alone, but we came and saved you. Maryanne smiled through her tears. And I saved you. We saved each other, Abigail corrected wisely. And she was right. 6 months later, spring in Wyoming. The garden behind the Harrison house, now fully rebuilt and expanded, was bursting with life. Abigail and Sophie, taller and more confident, planted vegetables while laughing and arguing over which seed went where. Their voices filled the air with sweeter music than any song. Mark dug a new row, his shirt soaked with sweat under the spring sun. No more shadows in his eyes, just light. Maryanne, now Maryanne Harrison, planted beside him, her hands in the rich soil, her heart at peace for the first time in her life. Mom, look, Sophie called, holding up a worm with fascination. Mom. The word still made Maryanne's heart swell, nearly to bursting. She went to the girl, admired the worm, kissed the top of her head. Mark watched her work with his daughters, their daughters now, and smiled. There was no betrayal in loving again. There was honor, in life, in love, in possibility. Maryanne straightened, wiping dirt from her hands, and looked at the open Wyoming horizon. The distant mountains, the endless sky. No longer hiding in a solitary cabin, she was reaching toward a full life, noisy, chaotic, beautiful, to add a touch of their new family. Tradition, they planned to bake apple pies together that evening, using a recipe passed down from Maryanne's grandmother, filling the house with the scent of cinnamon and warmth. What are we doing for next Christmas? Abigail asked, taking her hand. Maryanne and Mark exchanged a look loaded with love and shared memories. Maryanne smiled. We're going to fill it with love. Abigail nodded, satisfied. Good, because now we're a real family. And they were, against all odds, against every fear, against the solitude that had threatened to consume them all. They'd chosen love. They'd chosen to stay. They'd chosen life. And that choice had made all the difference. The sun shone on the Harrison family as they worked together in their garden, planting seeds that would bloom in summer. Building a future none of them had believed possible just months ago. Maryanne closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the warm sun on her face, her daughter's laughter in her ears, her husband's solid presence at her side. No more solitude, no more running, just love, just family, just home. We've finally reached the end of the trail, my dear friends. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining me on this journey. Your subscription means the world to me, because it lets me keep researching and creating these stories I love to tell. Without you, my dear friends of the West, these tales wouldn't be possible. Give a like and subscribe to help me keep sharing the most fascinating legends of the frontier. Until next time, my dear friends, you're the reason these stories come to life.